Next, I'd like to draw a nice shining sun hanging over the valley. So let's switch our tool settings around. I'll set my stroke color to a nice red and the fill to a bright orange. And we'll switch over to our oval tool. I can drag up here in the sky. And of course, if I hold down Shift, I'll drag out a perfect circle. And we'll say that's our sun. Now, as we learned in our last chapter, if I were to move the sun around, I might run into some problems. For instance, if I wanted the sun setting over the hills, it's going to overlap the hills, and worse, if I select it after I've moved it there and pull it back out, it's going to cut a chunk out of the hill. That's not going to be too good for our animation later on. So let's do a few undos and get back to where we were. Now, in our last chapter, we talked about a few ways that we could keep that cutting from occurring. We could have used object drawing mode, or we could make our sun into a group. But in this chapter, I'd like to show you a better way, and that is using layers. If we look up the timeline at the top, we'll notice that everything that we've drawn so far is existing inside of layer 1. Now, we've got a lot of space here, so that implies that we can have some more layers. We can make another layer simply by clicking on this little icon down at the bottom of our timeline window, and now we have layer 2. Let's delete this sun and try again. I'll just double click and hit delete. And we can draw our sun in our new layer. Now, first of all, you'll notice we just have generic names for each one of our layers, and it's a good idea to actually give them better names. If you double click on the text, you can see that the layer name becomes editable, and we can type in anything we want. For the first layer, I'll just call that Valley, and we'll double click on the second layer and rename that one Sun. You'll also notice as I click on these layers, a little pencil icon bounces back and forth between the two. The pencil icon indicates whatever the active layer is. If you grab a drawing tool, whatever you draw will go into the currently active layer. So let's just choose our oval tool again. I'll draw the sun, holding Shift down to make sure I get a circle. And now our sun is in its own layer. What's really nice about that is we can move the sun anywhere we want. Let me switch over to my selection tool. I'll double click to grab both pieces, move it over the hills like we did before. I'll click away from it, and when we go back to move it out, you can see that the hill wasn't cut. In addition to just keeping our elements from cutting each other apart, layers actually have a lot of other settings that are going to help us organize and manage the items in our scene. For instance, you'll notice we have a little eyeball and a lock icon above the layers, and if we click down below that in either one of the layers, we can hide the contents of that layer temporarily so that we can work on other elements. I can hide the valley as well, or reveal the sun and bring it back up so we can work on it. Now, if you want to see the items in a layer, but you don't want to be able to select them or change them at all, you can use the lock icon. Now, notice I can't click on any of the items in my hill or river when the valley is locked, and I can just go up and unlock it whenever I need to. This last item is also a selection. It allows you to turn on what's called outline mode. Now, when I click on that box, it takes the items in that layer and drops them all down to outlines, removing all the fills from the view. They're still there, they're just hidden. And in a crowded or complex scene, this might make it easier to go in and select or edit individual elements. We can turn on outline mode for the sun layer as well, and there you can see that the color of the box indicates the color of the lines that are going to show up, so you can also tell which item is in which layer. If you click on any of the items at the top, it will simply change all of the layers you have. So I can click at the top here to bring both of my layers back out of outline mode, and I could click at the top to either lock both layers or hide both layers. One additional thing that will help you manage your layers and the items in them is just selection itself. Note when I click on the valley layer, all the items that are included in the valley layer are automatically selected. So I get both hills and the river. And if I do the same thing to the sun layer, you can see that the sun gets selected. So this is a really easy way to select a whole bunch of items. On the reverse side of things, if you click on something on the stage, it will automatically switch the active layer to the layer containing the item you selected. And when you start to load up your files with lots of layers and lots of objects, those two selection techniques will help you find things much, much easier. Let's create another layer for some mountains in the background. I'll click on the sun layer up here at the top and insert a new layer. What I'd like you to notice at this point is that the new layer will always go above whatever layer you currently have selected. We'll rename this layer Mountains. Remember, I just double-click on the text. And let's set up our drawing tools to draw some mountains. I'm going to click on my pencil tool. I'll go with the black outline, and we'll pick a brown kind of fill. And I'll set my pencil tool to straighten. We'll get some nice jaggy mountains in the background. And I'll continue drawing out a couple of lines that will close off the bottom of my mountains so that we can create a fill. Switch over to my paint bucket. I've already got my brown color selected, and we'll drop that fill in. And then I'll just get rid of the lines. I'll go to my selection tool, double click on all the black lines, and since they're all connected, they are all selected at once, and hit delete. Now you notice my mountains are on top of the hills and the river if we move it down here a little bit. So we're going to need to do a little stacking. And that's the other thing that layers are good for. The reason the mountains are on top of the sun and the valley is because the mountain layer is on top of the sun and the valley layers. To move things around in stacking order on the stage, all you have to do is grab a layer and move it down through the stack. You can see the indicator showing where the layer is going to go. I can drop it right there, and there we can see my mountains are in the background as they should be. I'll move them around a little bit, and I'll even grab this bottom section here once I deselect the mountains and make sure that it fills in so that we don't see any gaps. We can still go ahead and adjust any of the lines that we've drawn already using the same techniques we saw before. I'll snap that point right up to the corner and get rid of that jagged peak up there at the top, and maybe I'll pull these out just a tiny bit to give a little rounding to these so it doesn't look quite so regular.